Hey budget gardeners, Vita Loca here. Join me today as we talk about reusing old potting soil. So let's go. I continued to be very busy working in my garage. As many of you know, I love to have lots of window boxes, hanging baskets, pots, and containers in my landscape. I even have a number of raised beds, and all of those things require potting soil or potting mix each year. There were many years that I used to just take the potting soil at the end of the season and just put it out in my vegetable garden and just spread it out there. Or I would spread it out in one of my flower beds. And there's nothing wrong with that. You can definitely do that. But if you're like me and you have a ton of containers that need to be restocked and refilled with potting mix each year, that can get very expensive. So during the last number of years, I've moved towards reusing my potting mix whenever possible. So as I'm emptying all these containers and pots over the last number of days, it got me thinking I should probably make a video showing you what I'm doing with all the potting soil that's coming out of all these containers. Because maybe you're in the same boat. Maybe you're emptying hanging baskets like this one, or window boxes, or pots, and you're not sure what to do with all that potting soil. I was doing some research on the topic so that I can make this video for you. And whenever I do research, I oftentimes like to go to reputable sources. And when I say reputable sources, it's typically a university of some kind because I feel comfortable getting information from university websites. And it doesn't need to be a university that's local to me. It can be any university in the area. But I do like to get information from places like that, and I like to share that with you. But I will tell you, when it comes to using my potting mix, in small little hanging baskets like this, I'm definitely not going to use a ton of used potting soil because it's a smaller or a shallow type of container. I'm more likely to use it in something much bigger, a bigger pot, a raised bed, even a window box, part of a window box, like 1/3 of a window box. But in something small like this, or if I had a small pot, I'd prefer to just use fresh or new potting soil. But there are rules to follow if you are going to reuse your potting soil. And that's where my research comes into play. So let's go ahead and go over some of the things that I found on the internet. So we're going to start with Oklahoma State University. They had a wonderful article that talked about reusing potting soil that I really liked. So why would you reuse potting soil? The biggest reason is to save money. Gardening can get expensive, but it doesn't have to be expensive. There are so many ways you can save money in your garden. And one way is by reusing your old potting soil. Now, if you only had one small pot that you fill for your garden every single year, by all means, go out and buy new potting mix each year. That's totally fine. But if you have a ton of pots, a ton of containers, raised beds, whatever that you need to be filling, it definitely makes sense to reuse old potting mix if you can. So when we're talking about potting soil, we're not talking about dirt or soil that's out in your landscape. It is typically some sort of combination of peat, vermiculite, and composted matter. So one thing to keep in mind when you're going to reuse your potting soil is you want to make sure that the plant material that you're removing from your pots and containers did not have any sort of disease. If it did have disease, I would not use that potting soil that was in that container. And when you're going to reuse your potting soil, keep in mind during the past growing season, all the good nutrients have leached out of that container. Every single time I watered this hanging basket, the nutrients from it leached out through the bottom of the container. The core part of the soil is fine, but I will be amending it next spring, so just keep that in mind. And I can give you a little hint. Every spring when I create all my container pots, I definitely add a slow release fertilizer in the top part of each of those containers. That is very key. You definitely want to be doing that. Or you might just want to use compost and mix that into your potting soil. Some people don't want to use fertilizer because in a way, compost is a type of fertilizer. It really is up to you what you want to use. Now, some of us have really big, large pots or raised beds. Typically each spring, I like to replace the top 6 inches with new potting soil, with new compost. And if I want to, I can also add my slow release fertilizer in there at that time as well. So that's a usual general rule of thumb, is about 6 inches deep is where you're going to be adding your new material. And again, that's why when I'm talking about this hanging basket, it's not very deep. So it makes sense to be adding new potting mix into this next year. Now on the website, they do talk about not reusing potting soil that had weeds in it. Well, I can tell you that sometimes with my container pots, there were weeds that showed up in there. I personally don't stress about it because, again, a lot of the potting mix that I'm going to reuse will be on the bottom part of my pot. So a lot of times those weed seeds are not going to germinate. But even if they did, I can just pick them out. I just want to caution you about that, so that if you are going to reuse your potting soil, it may contain weed seeds in it. Of course, you could try to heat up your potting soil a lot of different ways. People take their potting soil, they put it out in the sun, and they let the sun basically bake it. Some people like to take boiling hot water and pour it on their potting mix. There are a lot of different options if you're very concerned about something like weed seeds germinating. So on the website, they do mention here viruses, fungi, and bacteria will remain in the potting soil long after the life of the plant. So that's where, again, I'm cautioning you to just make sure that whatever plant material you remove out of your pots and you're going to reuse that potting soil, just make sure that the plant material was pretty healthy. Now, at a minimum, if you don't want to use your potting soil in any of your window boxes, hanging baskets, or container pots or anything like that, you can always take your potting soil, you can put it out in your vegetable garden, you can put it in raised beds to top them off, you can even add it to your compost pile. Another way you can use your used potting soil is by filling up any sort of holes that you might have in your landscape. Maybe you had an animal dig out some sort of a hole and you need to fill it up. Some people like to take leaves and grass clippings. I remember as a kid, my dad used to do that, and that's fine, but the problem is those all break down pretty quickly. So you want to make sure that you're filling those holes with something a little more robust that has more structure to it. So used potting soil would be a great option for that. Right now I'm looking at Louisiana State University's website, and they gave a great option here that I really like. They said that you can basically fill in pockets on your lawn, because sometimes when you're walking on your lawn, you have little divots in there. So you can definitely lay it a nice thin layer out on your lawn if you want to do that. So on this Louisiana State University website, they say one way to be sure that soil is clean is to sterilize the soil. There are a couple of ways to sterilize the soil. One is to solarize the soil in the sun, which we just talked about earlier, and the other is to heat it up in an oven or a microwave. I'm not going to do that. I have so much of the soil. In fact, I've so far filled up 3 totes of the soil. But you definitely can get creative if you really want to sterilize your soil. I don't sterilize my soil, but I definitely want to throw that option out there for you. And you've seen me doing this in previous videos where I have something like this hanging basket and I'm removing any weeds, I'm removing any annuals that have been spent and have gone by at this point. Any perennials that I have in here, I'm digging them up and they're going back out in my landscape. And then I'm going ahead and I'm dumping out whatever potting soil is in here. That's usually the process you want to follow if you're emptying out any of your pots or containers. And what I started to do was I was taking this potting soil that I'm accumulating and I was originally putting them in pots. There are a few pots that I've reserved aside for putting some winter greens in. And those pots have been filled up, they've been topped off. I am not concerned about any root material that's in there because I'm not growing any small little plants from seed. I'm just going to be sticking different things like greens in there for the winter months. So it's a great time right now to be using this potting soil to top off any of your containers that you'll be using for fall or winter arrangements out in your landscape. I'm also reserving a lot of this potting soil and putting it in used bins or totes that I have. When my kids were little, I used to have totes that were labeled like 3 to 6 months, 6 to 9 months. If you've had children, you know what I'm talking about. And you like label the totes with their toys or with their shoes. Anyway, my kids are in college now. I have all these totes that I've been reusing over the last many years. And I'm stockpiling these totes with the used potting soil. I'm going to tell you why. I like to grow a lot of spring bulbs in pots, and I definitely don't need to buy potting soil. I'm going to use what I have. It totally makes sense. And I can also add bulb fertilizer into those pots as needed. I won't be doing that project until later this winter, and I'll be putting the pots in my garage. I've done that for the last few years. I love having a nice spring display of daffodils and tulips on my pots, but there's no need to buy potting mix. I have so much potting mix. So I'm stockpiling the potting mix. I'm going to keep it in my garage because my garage does not freeze. And then when the time is right, together we will build those pots. And I have a whole bunch of the tulips and daffodils that are actually down in my garage. They've been dormant down there from last spring, and we'll be doing that project together. I can't wait. But I wanted to tell you that's what I'm stockpiling a lot of my potting soil for, our winter pots as well as my spring pots. So start doing that. Start thinking about how you want to use your potting soil. And then here's a tip. If you plan on using that potting soil during these cold winter months like I will be doing, put the potting soil in an area where it's not going to freeze. I'm going to be putting it in my garage. My garage does not freeze, and that's where I'm going to be putting all the totes. So if you do want to sterilize your potting soil, I'm going to read a little bit more from what Louisiana State University recommends. They say you can use an oven. It can make the house smell very earthy, so just keep that in mind. Be sure to remove any insects. Place the soil in an oven-safe pan and cover with foil. Bake at 175 to 200 degrees Fahrenheit for 30 minutes. You can also microwave 2 pounds of soil in microwavable containers at full power for 90 seconds. Now that your soil is sterile, at that point you can then use it. And then you can continue to replenish it with nutrients because those will be depleted during the sterilization process. And how do you do that? You can do that simply by adding compost, either compost that you've made or compost that you've bought. And you can also add any other soil amendments that you want. And all of that is great. I wanted to just throw that out there for you. Like I mentioned, I will not be sterilizing or solarizing my soil. I'm going to be using it for winter containers and pots. I'm going to be using it for spring bulbs. And then any soil that's left over after all of that, I'll use next spring for my bigger pots and containers for my yard. I'm just going to call it LSU. That's the same as Louisiana State University. LSU also gives some common soil amendments that can be found at local garden centers or nurseries. There's compost, peat moss, mycorrhizae, topsoil, composted manure, worm castings, wood ash, mushroom compost, biochar, and then the list goes on after that. And all of these amendments, again, are for that top layer if you're going to be amending on top of the old potting soil that we're using here. And I have videos showing you my process for making my own potting soil, and I'll put a link to that video down in the description below. And again, all of this is great information when you want to recharge potting soil for the top part of your container pots. Next spring, I'll be making more videos showing you my process on how I do that. I feel pretty confident that a lot of my container pots and window boxes, hanging baskets, I felt like they looked very beautiful. And I just did a DIY mixing up my own mix of potting soil. And it was using a lot of ingredients that I already have on hand. And I'll be doing that next spring, and I'll show you my process for that. There are a lot of different recipes out there. So here's a fun one. The last thing that they added on the LSU website was reusing potting soil gives a new meaning to the term dirt cheap. There are many options for the reuse of potting soil. Save a few dollars so that you can buy more plants. And there you have it. I really hope you found this information useful. I wanted to get this video out there for you because you might be like me and you might be wondering what to do with all this used potting soil. There are a lot of different options. If you've been reusing your potting soil, drop a comment down in the comment section below and let us all know, how have you reused your potting soil? What are you doing to recharge it in the springtime? And what did you find useful from this video today? As always, if you have any questions or comments, I would love to hear from you. And until the next video, make it a great day with gardening.